Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the 5th Annual Adventist Archives Lectureship. First was in 2019, and now it's achieving some maturity. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. Michael W. Campbell. Michael Campbell is Director of the North American Division of Department of Archive Statistics and Research. So he is a counterpart of the North American Division, the position that I hold at the General Conference. Dr. Campbell is an ordained minister who previously spent a decade teaching in higher education in the Philippines and Texas at the Adventist International, what is it? It's the
Institute.
The Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies in the Philippines and at Southwestern Adventist University in Keene, Texas. He is a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Seventh-day Adventism, which is coming out shortly, and is under contract with Irwin's to write a forthcoming textbook co-authored with Dr. Edward Allen at Union College about Adventist history. Dr. Campbell has recently organized academic paper sessions at the American Society of Church History Conference and the Conference on Faith and History. And most recently, he organized, as we heard just 10 days ago, a conference on women in Adventist history that was held here at WAU. Dr. Campbell has contributed many articles in popular, peer-reviewed, and reference works. Some of his research interests include a history and theology of the Lord's Supper, the Taiping movement in China, which was Seventh-day Sabbatarians in an odd way, and the history of missions. He is the author of 12 books, including most recently We Stand on Their Shoulders, published by Pacific Press in 2023, and 1922, The Rise of Adventist Fundamentalism, published by Pacific Press in 2022. He is also the author of many articles in the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, and we at GCASTR, who are responsible for the ESDA, are very grateful to him for being so actively involved and contributing to the ESDA. Dr. Campbell also contributes regularly to the Sabbath School Rescue and Adventist Pilgrimage podcasts. I haven't listened to the former, but if any of you are interested in Adventist history, Adventist Pilgrimage podcast is well worth a listen. He and his wife Heidi, who is a PhD candidate at Baylor University in early modern history, have 2 teenage children, Emma and David. And would you join me in welcoming Dr. Campbell as our Adventist Archives lecturer?
Well, good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming out for this lecture this evening. It's always a delight when you can share some of the research that you've been working hard on. And thank you to David and to the Honors College, Professor Haas and Professor Scriven. So thank you for this opportunity. Before I dive into my topic here this evening, I was debating for some time. Some people ask me about David Trim, and I say, it's one of the great privileges of my life. I actually really covet those times when we have an opportunity to have lunch just together and go back and forth on some of our research and ideas. I find it, just as the Bible says, as iron sharpens iron, and it's been just very enriching. I want you to see this picture before we talk about the individual, the man, Irwin Henry Evans, I.H. Evans. It's delightful when you can find sources. Now, there's a lot of black and white photographs, and now you can colorize these, but this was actually found in a box at the Review when they were packing things up some years ago, and somebody grabbed a box of slides that were being thrown out. This is before the Review closed, and sometimes they just throw stuff away. Someone found this as a box of colorized slides, and this was one of them, and this is a color photograph, early color photography of Irwin Henry Evans towards the end of his life. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so it's really special when you find something such as this. I also want to just mention briefly, because part of the fun of archives, before I get into my topic, is finding new sources. And just this past week, found something that Adventist historians have been looking for decades. I know Merlin Burt was looking for this for his dissertation, could not locate a copy of this. Jim Nix, you just emailed me this morning. I heard that you found this. Can I see a copy of this? But I wanted you to see this first. At the Adventist Archives lectureship, This was found in the heritage room, just in that glass display. And there's some boxes in the corner tucked away. And I was just looking through some Millerite things. We put a display together of that went with the Conference on Women in Adventist History. I invite you to look at that afterwards. But this is the very first issue. We knew it existed, but no one had ever seen a copy. The very first issue of The Hope of Israel, published in Topsom, Maine, by William Hyde. We knew he published or printed Millerite stuff. So Dragoslava, I'm going to have to update my article on William Hyde already. I mean, look at this. But when you find new sources, that's when you're as good as the sources you can find. And so that is in this display case. I invite you to look at this article. In fact, the last page, Nick, there is an article on abolitionism. So right away, I called Kevin Burton. I think he just about hit the roof. Said, I got to put this in my dissertation. And I could go on and spend the whole lecture just talking about the significance of this item. But for me, it's very special. And you get to be some of the very first ones to even know that this exists. I hope that we'll do like a news release and let people, the church, more widely know that it is available, thanks to the preservation efforts of what happens here in the Heritage Room, in the library here at Washington Adventist University. And so I applaud our archivists and our historians and so on, many of you who have spurred me on. And I give special tribute and thanks to Ashley Chisholm over there, because she is one of those for my presentation tonight that helped me. Not only was I working through published sources, but many unpublished sources in the General Conference archives, that correspondence. And so that richness has helped me to develop this presentation. So I give you thanks. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, David, and your whole team for what you do for those of us trying to do research and to put this together. Well, my subject for this evening is Irwin Henry Evans. And I think you probably know why I would be interested in him. Well, two reasons. One is because of the 1919 Bible Conference, because I've spent a little bit of time focused and interested on Adventism and fundamentalism in that topic. So I was already somewhat familiar with him, but also working at the North American Division. There was initially a North American Division 100 years ago. And what I wanted to do is uncover how did that North American Division happen? And part of what I'm here on this quest is to try to understand that a little bit better in context by pursuing kind of the origins and background of this individual. And to the best of my knowledge, no one has written a popular or any kind of significant biographical treatment of someone who I would argue tonight is very seminal to the beginnings of Adventism in the 20th century, informing the church the way we have it today as a world church. And so I want to explore his life, give you a little bit of background. We'll talk about how the North American Division began and then how it shifted and morphed in the complex relationship of the North American Division and the General Conference that continues even to this day. Well, Irwin Evans was born April 10, 1862 in North Plains, Ionia County, Michigan, to William and Ruth Evans. He was baptized at the age of 12, and as a youth, quote, he held the ministry in view as his goal, wrote one of his friends, and he, quote, used to go out and preach to the stumps on his father's farm. That, by the way, came from A.W. Spalding, who went on to applaud him as someone who was always prepared and for his gracious, winning form of address, which made his preaching so charming and so effective. Evans would go on to write the very first Adventist book, Significant Treatment, on the topic of homiletics or preaching, for any of you interested in applied theology. He would go on to be a minister himself. I was able to find this through some descendants of the family. It's always fun when you can find some of that genealogical information. And so he began initially, received his licentiate credentials in 1882, began teaching that winter, very soon shifted into doing evangelism while he's teaching. He talks about going out with his students, holding evangelistic meetings, getting them involved. So he obviously has a passion for soul winning. And then he would receive his ministerial license in And like many pastors early on in their formative years in training, you get sent away to kind of see what you're made of and see if you can actually pass muster, right? And so he is sent to the far off land of Kentucky, where he will actually find and discover, they will discover that he is a very effective soul winner, raise up a number of churches, and while he is there, become involved in the tract society. So he's early on very interested in print. And that next summer at Kent meeting, the 1886 Kent meeting, he will be ordained. And once he's ordained, as also tends to happen even to this day, he gets called away, this time to return to his home conference in Michigan as the conference president. And so he will serve in Michigan from 1887 on. His focus of his administration, very interesting as you read these sources. It's hard for me to summarize in just a few minutes that we have. I think there's something like 30,000 plus references in print, not counting all of the unpublished references to Evans. So that gives you sort of the scope. Some of these people we study in Adventist history, there's maybe a limited number of references, but in this case, it shows you the incredible contribution, how he was right at the center of the action in church headquarters, and you'll see why here in just a few minutes. But early on, he will become in charge of the Sabbath School Association, the Health and Temperance Association. He was passionate about building confidence in the work of the church. Quote, when our people understand the workings of our institutions, he wrote, and the different branches of the cause, they will have more confidence in the work of God. So he's also not only passionate about soul winning and publishing, but also in transparency and leadership, that if people understand how the church works, that they will begin to trust church leadership more. And so church leaders need to explain the workings, the inner workings of the church. He will early on marry Emma Ferry. I wish we had a picture. I have not been able to identify a picture of her, who tragically will die in 1903. I'll mention a little bit more about that later. They will have 4 children, notably Jerome Fargo, who was the founding president of Michigan Conference, or very, very early on, who was a mentor of his early on in ministry. And then as president of Michigan Conference, one of his first initiatives will be to train church workers. So he's systematizing how he goes about his leadership. And this is intriguing because training church workers, teachers, Bible workers, pastors, becomes a hallmark of his ministry, of his leadership. He will organize the largest ever canvassing institute up to that point in 1893, with some 200 people that will be in attendance. And while they're trying to train each other to do more evangelism in the church, it's interesting to me that he is so mission-minded and focused that they raise funds to send a missionary for India. So that's just shows and demonstrates that kind of passionate missional heart that he would have. And not only that, but he sees a need for the Michigan Conference, not only far away, but to sponsor missionaries to go away to Canada. I love this because I'm Canadian. Yeah. And so they will raise funds. A.T. Jones will go across the border from Detroit. They will raise up a church. In fact, that's not enough. They said there's a big city in Toronto. We do not have a single Seventh-day Adventist in the city of Toronto. So we will sponsor 2 Bible workers. And over the next 2 years, they will actually raise up a small group of believers in Toronto, which will become the beginnings of Adventism in the city of Toronto as a result of Evans' leadership. And there will be a church. They will raise funds for a church that's then dedicated by 1895. Well, no doubt with somebody with a clear sense of organization as well as mission, it's not surprising that he would go on to increasingly more significant responsibilities within the denomination. By 1895, he is the General Conference Association, the head of the General Conference Association Executive Board. 1897, he becomes officially the business agent for that association and a member of the General Conference Executive Committee, a position that he will hold and be a part of that committee to the very end of his life. In 1898, he'll become a vice president of the Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association, which basically will enmesh him in the publishing work of the church. And intriguingly, he will, in the 1890s, start preaching about, and as he put it, receive ye the Holy Ghost. He will write about angels and the Holy Spirit, and that will be a hallmark of his sermon topics that he will preach about the rest of his life. He believes in revival, and so he's obviously spurred on by what we would call the holiness movement, and there's a number of others that have written on this topic. Also, intriguingly, in 1899, he says it's 50 years since the first Adventist publication. We should have our publishing houses be out of debt. So he declares 1899 to be the year of Jubilee, begins raising funds around the church to make sure that the Review and Herald and other publishing agencies are completely debt-free. By the way, no sooner does he do that than disaster strikes, but I'll come to that in just a minute. 1899 becomes head of the Foreign Mission Board and the International Tract Society. Again, key organizations within the denomination focused on mission, both sending out missionaries as well as literature. So he is kind of mission central for the Adventist Church by the late 1890s. In fact, he is such a trusted leader that when the Christiana Publishing House has an incredible, horrible scandal. In fact, in 1899, 1900, this is all the topic of the gossip of the church and letters back and forth among church leaders, like how could this happen? So basically the short version of the story is they had a church leader that was there that didn't know what they're doing and got the institution into a lot of debt. I mean, just astronomical amounts of debt that they're just sure that they were going to have to close it down. And Evans is sort of like the troubleshooter of the General Conference. We'll send our best guy to come in, stabilize things. So he goes over there for like 6 months, helps them get on a firm financial footing once again, and helps raise money to help alleviate that debt. And so, again, it shows you kind of the trust that church leaders had in him. And of course, he will become, by 1901, officially the head of the Publishing Association. He is the head of the Review and Herald for less than a year. When you know what happens, it burned to the ground, February 18, 1902. And so this created a very awkward situation because he loved his church. He wanted to see the Review turn a corner financially. He'd been raising money for it, saw the need for spirituality. He took Ellen White's counsel seriously that there needs to be reforms, spiritual reforms at the Review among the workers, etc. And then to see it just disaster strike such as this. And he will spend most of the next 3 years, he will be the point person that church leaders will look to take whatever is left in Battle Creek after the sanitarium and all these disasters strike in Battle Creek to move church headquarters from Battle Creek to here in Tacoma Park. So, for example, he will be the head of the search committee that will look first in New York, and then eventually come down here to Tacoma Park and find this particular property. Oh, one more disaster that will strike is right after the Review burns, his beloved wife will tragically die of endometriosis, and so just absolute tragedy that happens there. By 1903, Irwin will be elected treasurer of the General Conference, and then actually, I'm sorry, I got those dates wrong. So it's February, the Review burns, 1902, and then it's later that year that his wife dies, then he's elected treasurer. So you can just see it's all in a sequence. May 13, 1903, there's his wife that dies. This dual loss, you can just imagine as a church leader to have the dual loss of losing the Review, one of the treasured institutions of the church, and his wife at the same time would put someone into a tailspin. But hardly had he had both of these tragedies happen, then he starts another major campaign to educate the church about its mission. He's always passionate about the mission of the church. In July 4th, he's the one that comes up with this idea of having a special offering to help build up the work in Australia. So personal tragedy was not about to hold him back. And it will be that, again, he has 4 children as a widower, that he will meet one of the editors at the Review who was editing, I think, the youth instructor, as I recall. Anyway, she was well known as a book editor as well as editor of her periodicals. Adelaide B. Cooper, who he will wed that next year, and she will raise his children with him, and they will all become stalwart pillars within the church, but that's a story for another time. Very, very interesting. So you begin to see the trust that the church has in him. He's now one of the 3 officers of the General Conference, which makes him, I think, a pretty significant figure in Adventist history in and of itself. But he'll become even more significant, I will argue. But I like this particular article that he wrote that I think helps to describe his psyche, his mentality, that helps us get a glimpse into his mind. This is in 1905. This, again, they're just literally building the Adventist presence here in Tacoma Park. They just purchased the property. And they are literally building these buildings around us on this property here that will become this institution, as well as the rest of the institutions in this area. He writes, the time was when the General Conference Committee could look after every branch of the work and know all the plans set on foot for prosecuting the same. That day is past. Local autonomy must be given to all these different fields, and local responsibility for the success or failure of the enterprise he started must be assumed. So he has a strong focus in his understanding of mission, supporting mission, but not only do we do mission for the sake of sharing the gospel, but we need to empower the people who receive the message as the most effective way for mission to move forward. And I think this is very significant because I think some people have a very negative assessment of missions in Adventist history and missions in general, that there's just colonialism and people want to dominate and so on. But here you see very early on in the development of missions in our church, a very different kind of perspective and this is one of our key church leaders. And I think that's very interesting. Also, one of the more intriguing things is 1907. I'll just highlight this briefly. 2 shakeups that stir the pot, so to speak. One will be that Lewis Sheath, who Doug Morgan, I believe, has spoken for this in the past, has written a book about Lewis Sheath. He will leave Adventism. That will cause quite a stir, and he will be at the center of all of that taking place, trying to mediate it. And he expresses his great disappointment when they are not able to successfully resolve this, and he unfortunately and his church will leave Adventism, and that's a story for another time. Also, the other thing that he'll be literally shaken is when he goes with Eugene Farnsworth and Luther Warren, who will be famous for his work on the early beginnings of what do you call it? The raising money, missionary money at Christmas time. People will in gathering. Thank you, Luther Warren, and they will actually go down to Kingston, Jamaica. And while they're there, they have this massive earthquake that destroys a lot of the buildings. One of the missionaries down there will tragically die. Thankfully, they had not started their training conference, and so all the church workers who would have been in the building that collapsed were not in the building. And they were off-site, traveling somewhere, visiting a school, and so they felt that their lives had been providentially spared. So it's kind of a little bit of interesting side drama. Also, he himself will go as a missionary to the Far East, to Asia, to the early work in China. He'll become the head of the Adventist Church's work in China, as well as Asia. Initially, it will eventually be China, but in the formative stages, it will include basically most of Asia. And so he remarks about there's great stories, mission stories of him traveling around, holding evangelistic meetings, baptizing people. He will be there and participate in the very first baptism of Seventh-day Adventists in Manila, in the Philippines, which is interesting. L.V. Finster, he's not in the picture because he's the one taking the picture, but he's there and he writes about it, and other people write about him being there. So he is visiting. It's on his trip in 1911 that this first baptism takes place. And that's significant, I think, for a church, because not only will we have a significant presence in North America, but today we have a significant presence in the Philippines, as well as in China and other parts of the world. So he'll spend time over there until 1913. But first, let me give you just a little bit of context quickly. I want to mention briefly, because he plays a significant role in the development of the North American Division. Well, how does the North American Division begin? Well, the earliest I can find is a reference to W.W. Prescott in 1904, who is assigned, and I quote, as the vice president for North American Division. And you will have George A. Irwin, W.T. Knox, who are all variously referred to. Now, I will say this, it's not always perfectly consistent. Sometimes they will say Vice President just variations of it, but you get the idea that this is a specially designated church leader in the inner circle of church leadership for the work in America. So you have some that are focused on missions, but you have one person assigned for North America. And so he will take a significant role in 1913, May 26, 1913, 372 delegates will vote to create what would they term, I'm using their language, the North American Division Conference with its own constituency and officers. This would help to decentralize leadership. And if you're familiar with Adventist development of church organization, this is a pivotal moment as the church reorganizes and develops divisions through the same time period in other parts of the world. This will be an opportunity, as they view it, to strengthen the mission of its church and, as they put it, its home base to further establish outreach. And I think this is very significant that the North American Division at its inception was created for the purpose of mission. For mission. That's I think absolutely crucial to understand. In fact, they have a little debate going. Where will they locate the North American Division? Top choices are College View, Nebraska, and Kansas City, Missouri, before ultimately they say, it just makes sense to have it in Tacoma Park. And so you can get it forums for business sessions much more easily. And they will have their first constituency meeting, and this is documented. We have the minutes of this and so on. That are subsequently made available, and they will elect on May 30th, 1913, Evans as the first president. This very significant, and call him to return from China to head up the work in North America. They will also elect at that same session O.A. Olson as the first vice president, and they will begin operations on June 1st. Now, this is what they voted and appears in the minutes. So you could say the North American Division really began June 1, 1913. Okay, this is the fun and beauty of doing primary source research, right? 2 days later, they'll add additional officers, and I'd say that you don't really have a functioning organization unless you actually have, not just in name, but you actually have a leadership structure, right? And so you will have George B. Thompson and W.T. Knox, both of whom deserve significant biographies for their own contributions in and of themselves. And there will be departmental leaders assigned for all the traditional things you would expect in an organization such as Sabbath school and education, publishing, et cetera, et cetera. And they were assumed the North American Division was tasked with, quote, the general watch care of all institutions located within its territory, and a practice was established of holding an annual fall council where the full North American Division Executive Committee would then meet. And the first such meeting was held in Tacoma Park that year, October 14 to 22. Today we call those year-end meetings, and they begin tomorrow, which is why I've had a very busy week. Also, they have their own stationery. I love this. Here you can see all those names that I just referred to. This is the fun of archival research, is finding this. And here's the original stationery and those lovely boxes that Ashley and was so kind to pull for me. And here's actually a picture of our first president. Now, it's significant that they would call someone who is a superb administrator recognized within North America, as well as somebody who had served time outside of North America, as being the kind of ideal person to take up the helm of leadership here, helping to make sure that the work of the church in North America both remained strong, while at the same time kept a significant missional focus. This combination of strong leadership and mission will go closely together. It will also start the first North American Division periodical. Anybody know the name of it? Just curious. Several Adventist historians here tonight. The Home Missionary Gazette. We still have an Adventist journey, right, that we have today. So the idea of a division should have a periodical. This becomes very he will also begin organized work for the work of indigenous native peoples. This is the earliest I found anywhere in the history of the church. I know that there were people that did go off and do things, but to officially organize like a department to look out and strategically focus on indigenous peoples in North America. And he will also play a central role in establishing and building up the work of Loma Linda, which at this particular time was at a very delicate time and close to being closed. And so he will help to turn that around. And so a number of significant contributions. What I find probably most interesting in the hundreds of letters that do exist from him in the General Conference archives that I examined in preparation for tonight is one of his first things after returning from China was to send out a survey to all church administrators, all conferences and unions. Give me an assessment. Tell me how many church workers, are they effective, and give a rating scale of how effective they were. And there's all these surveys that go along with each letter that are attached. So he's, and I think this is significant because, you know, we're still doing statistics and research, right? So in a way, he's kind of really the father of doing statistical surveys in the church. I don't know of a widespread survey of this magnitude before Evans takes the helm of leadership, at least not that I'm aware of. And so this is doing assessment. How is the health of the church in North America? Because he believed if we have a healthy church in North America, we will have a strong and healthy church around the world. Here's the picture of the other three officers. Here you have Evans in the middle and Knox on the right that will form this leadership team at the North American Division. Intriguingly, ultimately, there will be a conflict at the center of church leadership. We're not sure of all the details. We know the conflict existed. There will be a number of instances in the correspondence, 3 times specifically, where he's writing to very close trusted friends. And he said, that there were some struggles. I'm using my own words, but just to give you a sense of the idea of what he's writing about. So clearly some struggles between him and Daniels. And he says, you know, I don't want to get into the details in this letter, but the next time we meet in person, I'll tell you all about it. Okay, so you know that there's something juicy cooking up because not only does he allude to it those 3 times, but there will be others who will allude to this growing struggle. And Daniels, for his part, will write that there should be a strong, self-directing, practically independent organization thrown in between the General Conference and its resources. It will transfer the control of the base supplies from the General Conference to the division. Clearly, at the center of the conflict is the fact that there's a significant amount of money and other resources, personnel, and who will control those? Will it be Evans who calls the shots, or will it be Daniels? And that seems, as you tease out, it's always delicate to try to, when you're dealing with research like that, especially in something that sensitive, but there will be others who will write about it. T.E. Bowen, who will write about this, and he'll write it and state, while the organization has done good work in stimulating our people in the homeland and building up the work in our lines at the base, yet with the worldwide work in hand in America being the base of supplies, it seemed the General Conference Committee should have immediate direction of the work in the homeland. And he's specifically talking about the struggle in his letter between him and Evans and Daniels. Ultimately, church leaders will vote to return to the pre-1901 model without having a separate division, at least not functionally. Now, in terms of name, yes, there will be a North American division that will continue through most of the rest of the 20th century, but having an actual real significant structure where there's a separate financial structure and a leadership structure, more than just a person, but a whole leadership team. That will basically go away. And this will lead others to write about this quote unquote interesting experience, right? I mean, you just, you know, people are trying to tease this out that had resulted in this unworkable arrangement that will result in the 1918 Annual Council, which votes to phase out the North American Division. This will be the first attempt. One more person, Spicer, who I love, one of my heroes in Adventist history, if it's possible to do that. I love Spicer, and he will write to one of his good friends, the missionary W.S. Hyatt. You will see by the next review that the proposition was made at the Minneapolis, that's the annual council that year, to discontinue the North American Division. It will be settled at the General Conference. And some feel that it's an extra wheel here at the home base, where the General Conference has its headquarters being composed practically of the same men. The only difference is the officers, and we shall see what the conference decides. And of course, you know the outcome is they decide to do it. Now, I think it's interesting that church leaders form the North American Division for the sake of mission, and they dissolve the North American Division for the sake of mission. And so I try to argue that the North American Division has always been about mission. It's not been perfect, but it's about mission. 1985, we'll see the reappearance of the North American Division. Now, Dave and I've had some friendly debate back and forth writing about this. It's the beginning of a process. It's a complex process, but it will begin in 1985. Again, where you see not just a person with a vice president of the North American Division, and of course there's minutes and everything else, where you start having a functioning separate financial structure and leadership team, a whole team of officers, right? And so you will have a president, Charles Bradford, a secretary, Fred Thomas, and a treasurer, George Crumley, who will then form a separately functioning. Again, there were minutes before, but now we have a truly separate organization. And I love that their first motto in 1985 is that the North American Division would be known as the Caring Church. The Caring Church. And I don't have time to go into all of this, but it will continue on as it grows. They'll develop a new magazine once again titled Celebration. Now it will change names several times, but that's initially the name that was announced. And so that's kind of fun. In his later years, Evans, after he is North American Division president, will serve as a vice president of the General Conference and as a general field secretary. He will become and remain one of the most influential figures within the structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church until the end of his life. He will write, and I think this is significant, as I mentioned, the first book on Adventist preaching. This is a picture on the screen so you can see it. And he will write the earliest book that I know of on angels, angelology, right? And the function of angels within the church and within scripture and everything else. And I think that's a beautiful cover of that. I think that was first printed, if I recall correctly, in 1918. So fairly early on. Of course, he will have spent his golden years here in Tacoma Park. And if we had time, we'd do an Adventist Heritage Tour where I could show you his home just down the street. And nearby in Rock Creek Park is his grave, where he and Adelaide are buried next to one another. And here lies one of the great stories of the history of one of the great administrators, certainly not far from perfect, but certainly made a vast contribution to the development of the church structure, and significantly would become the first president, at least for the purposes of this evening, first president of the North American Division, formed for the sake of mission, later dissolved for the sake of mission, but would remain committed to the mission of the church and build it up in some very significant ways. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to some time for some Q&A back and forth.
Dr. Campbell has kindly agreed to answer some questions, if there are any. So while people are formulating their questions, I'll start off with one. To understand the history of divisions, you really need to look at the other divisions that get formed before 1913. And you referred to Evans going as a missionary in 1909. What you didn't refer to is the fact he actually went to be president of the Asiatic Division.
Right.
And so there are divisions before 1913.
Correct.
And so actually he's president of the Asiatic Division. So that's a fairly substantial responsibility. Perhaps you'd like to say more about his years in the Asiatic Division.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Trim, because I think in my haste of trying to cover so much material, but certainly I think it's 1909, but you could correct me on that. Yeah, 1909, the Asiatic Division forms, and as you point out, he is the division president there, and that's his role. And that's part of the reason why they call him back. They said, you know what, this is one of our most trusted administrators, and if he knows how to run a division, if we're starting a new division, that he knows what a division should, how it should function. And I think this also contributes a little bit to the friction between him and Daniels, because it's very clear he's a strong administrator. He's not afraid to pull any punches with the assessment and everything else. And so here he is, he's used to running his own division without anyone looking over his shoulder. Now he's here in North America, and there's a lot of interesting correspondence back and forth where Daniels, at least early on, is trying to be very deferential to Evans. You know, the General Conference doesn't make appointments, so you need to consult Evans before any personnel changes, et cetera, but absolutely. And so the whole development of visions, it starts in 1909, it will continue in 1913 and continue through 1918. So that's a very pivotal time for the development of divisions through the 20th century, but that's that crucial time when divisions really are formulating. It doesn't happen instantaneously, it happens kind of more gradually, unlike, you know, like 1901, 1903. So great observation. I fully agree with you, Dr. Trim.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a fascinating episode that I was unfamiliar with, Michael. Looked like the NAD started in 1985. This prehistory is quite interesting, and as has been noted, it wasn't that it was the first division, and the difficulty was, I think, as noted, that because it was the North American division where most of the resources were, then suddenly it created complexity for the General Conference. And of course, currently, since 1985, we've had a division, but it's only been the last 3 or 4 years where we've had separate. When did the NAD building come into existence? 17. So
Yeah, so 6 years.
6 years now.
Yeah.
Do you think we've probably we have a greater input of resources from outside the North American division? I mean, what stops that same history from repeating itself? Are we at a different sort of
So for the benefit of the recording, I will just rephrase the question again, because this is being recorded and will be put on the Honors College website. So the question from Dr. Miller is, given what happened in between 1913 and 18, what stops history repeating itself? Why is there a separate North American division now and has been for some 38 years?
and a physical division maybe that for 6 years, yeah.
And a physical separation for 6 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. I think, you know, when you look back 100 years ago, and I think this is very significant, that when they talked about forming the North American division is for the sake of the mission of the world church, right? So he comes back and they bring him in as, he's like the troubleshooter of the administrators, right? Everybody knows that Evan shows up, there's a problem, and he's the fixer man, right? He's the coming in to take care of problems. And so I think they knew that they needed to strengthen the work. It wasn't as efficient, it wasn't. And it's interesting, after Evan spends that time, the 1920s would become the golden era of Adventist mission. So they've learned to harness those resources much more efficiently. What's to say that can't, well, I think more recently with the North American Division 1985, I think as I read the minutes and as I've studied how the North American Division was reformulated, there was definitely a growing sense that the North American Division needed more significant attention in terms of evangelism and development of the resources, organization of the resources, because as the church has then grown around the world, where you're not seeing that same kind of growth is in North America, right? And so they're looking at that and saying, you know what, North America really is a mission in and of itself. So we really need to have more intentional development of those resources and to if the church is to remain strong in this part of the world. So it's not, one place versus another place or against another place. It's recognizing all of the world church is a significant mission, and those resources need to be looked at and developed. And I think that sense, so when people talk about the North American Division separating from the General Conference, that kind of thing, there's different ways to look at it. But when my reading of the minutes is when it's reformulated, it's for the sake of mission once again. And I realize there's always challenges and conflicts and personality things, but my argument would be like, even when the North American Division separates physical locations, now there was some debates going on in the church about women's ordination, but the die had been cast long before there were any debates, because they were looking at, well, we need more resources, we need more space for the different parts of the North American Division. So it just happened to be bad optics, bad timing. That's my personal view of assessment of what happened. But it has a separate location, separate building now today, and continues to evolve. And you can trace from 85 to the present, there's step by step as North America then kind of takes its place as one of the divisions of the world church, just as we have elsewhere around the world church. Again, and I would argue for the sake of mission, the church needs to always be missional in its focus. And so people realize North America needs more care and attention to make sure that the work here in North America remains vibrant and strong. So that'd be my response. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance and complexity, and that story is still ongoing, right? So this year, the North American Division retained its own legal counsel. So for a long time, legal services were run through the General Conference. For many years, the archival function, which I now am responsible for, was just simply taken care of very graciously by the General Conference archives. And we continue to work closely together, but so that's an evolving process, wouldn't you say, Dr. Trim?
Yes.
Yeah.
So until the NAB moved out to its own headquarters in Columbia, the General Conference Archives was the North American Division Archives. General Conference Human Resources Department was the Division Human Resources Department. And even today, though the NAB has retained its own legal counsel, it continues to use the GC Office of General Counsel.
Absolutely.
So one could say that there hasn't been an absolutely complete separation even yet afterwards.
And I keep trying to remind people, we're part of the General Conference, the same as every other division. It's a division of the General Conference. So there are other divisions and they do the same thing. They have their own legal counsel, but if there's necessary or needed challenges, they will consult with the council at the General Conference, and the same thing's ongoing, as you pointed out. So there's still a close relationship. And I'll just publicly say this, you know, I've only been working at the North American Division, what, a year, not quite a year and a half. And, you know, despite all the politics and things, the sound bites that go out there, I will tell you that there's a strong sense when I go to different meetings and committees, there's a strong sense that we want to be portrayed. I hope I'm saying this right, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from. We want to be portrayed as supporting the work of the World Church, and especially supporting the work of the General Conference. And so there's always discussions. Well, we don't want to do that because we don't want to give the perception in any way of lessening our support. And I say that both personally as well as professionally, that's really an important aspect. And that's part of the culture of the North American Division is, hey, how can we work more closely in alignment and support the work of the World Church? And I love that. I love that sense. Again, I'm just reflecting more personally right now, but that's kind of the vibe, if you please, right? It's the vibe and tone of the spirit of the people, my colleagues, and I love that we're just down the street from the General Conference, and it's possible to be able to have the privilege to consult with some of my colleagues here at the General Conference Archives and so on, because it gives us the privilege to work closely in harmony together, or at least we attempt to try. That's just my personal 2 thoughts right there. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just out of curiosity, because I'm curious, was there any evidence of any interplay between all these folks and the college?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the college is right at the center of all the action, right? So you've got the sanitarium, you've got the college, the General Conference is just down the street. They have a publishing house, and the General Conference will just be what, a mile and a half down the street down this way. And so all of this is closely intertwined, and many of the homes of church leaders are between here and there, and which makes this such a rich area and so the idea of education, training people to be church workers, you know, that's the key resource that sort of there's a little bit of a tension or power struggle, right? Of who gets to call the shots on those resources. And the key resource everyone wants to know is personnel and money. That's where it comes down to. And so there has to be that balance of making sure there's enough of those resources for the work that's here, so you don't cripple the work that's here, but at the same time, also a spirit of sacrifice to make sure that whatever can be spared is sent, so that the work of the church in other parts of the world that desperately need it can also have access to it. And so that tension is a tension that doesn't go away. It's a tension that exists through much of the 20th century, and it probably, you might even say it's a tension that exists today, right?
And to further develop the answer to your question, originally the college was the Foreign Mission Seminary. It's not widely known, but originally it was a General Conference institution. As the Foreign Mission Seminary, students who were going to be people who were going to be missionaries came here and studied for a year or 2 years. Even though there were many volunteers for missionaries, I guess it's a subject that needs research as to why it changed. Maybe there weren't enough students to come. Maybe there was a pressure to get people out into the mission field more quickly instead of giving them that detailed training. Today, the training that missionaries have before they go out is a 3-week institute, as compared to a year or 2 years. I think you would say that the people who went out 110 years ago were better prepared. But eventually it wasn't succeeding, and so they converted it into a Columbia Union Conference institution. The GC people stayed on the board of Washington Missionary College as it first became, and then Columbia Union College. And we have board minutes of the university in the General Conference archives because there were a significant portion of General Conference people who were on the board into at least the 1970s or 1980s. So there's a definite interplay between the General Conference and this institution.
Yeah, I might just add, since we did a conference of women in Adventist history, the Foreign Mission Seminary had at least 3 women who were on the faculty. So long before Leona Running, there were women who were teaching on the earliest faculty of the Foreign Mission Seminary, which is kind of intriguing little bit of Adventist history trivia for you.
And General Conference staff taught in the Foreign Mission Seminary.
That was the attraction, right?
Yeah,
That was the attraction.
yeah, because they were all so close.
This became the new Battle Creek.
Jonathan.
Quick question. So we know that in the modern church, there is sometimes tension between divisions for a variety of reasons, cultural, theological, etc. Was there evidence that there was tension between the first North American division and the General Conference in any particular way that maybe led to it being sort of abolished, or was it really just a sort of a resources, personnel kind of feeling like there's an overlap? I know you said it was sort of went away because of mission, but could you expand a little bit more on maybe if there were some tensions that led to that?
Yeah, I wish we knew more, right? I wish we had the diaries of Evans for that time period. The Evans correspondence early on the first half of his presidency of the North American Division, we have hundreds of letters, right? Actually, we have hundreds of letters. And then suddenly the files after like 1917, 1918, when you'd want to find out the juicy part about how it kind of fell apart, that correspondence is missing. And so we just don't have it. Now, sometimes you can glean a few tidbits from other correspondence from that time period, but the key source where you'd expect to find that material is gone. And then we're also missing some of the Daniels correspondence. We don't have all of his presidential material. We have some of it. But again, it's kind of like with the part that you're really wanting to find is missing. And so you keep looking because who knows, maybe it's out there somewhere and it's just in some closet waiting for someone to discover some document that's been
Over there.
yeah. So I don't know, maybe it's in the basement here for all I know, but I haven't been able to find the key documents. And so you're kind of having to reconstruct as best you can, as carefully as you can from the correspondence. And you can find from at least maybe 6, for sure 6, maybe 7 different people that are in the inner circle, and they're all definitely making these allusions to it. And so they're referencing, and so you can tease that out a little bit. But again, like Evans, when someone's really pushing him, obviously they know something's up and they're trying to get information from Evans. It's like, I'll talk to you in person about it. So I'm like, really? You had to do that. You couldn't have just written that out for me. And so, so the best we can determine, could there have been a personality conflict? Well, it's hard to know, or was it truly just a struggle of resources? Well, certainly that was at the center of it, but as part of it, we have to also acknowledge our limitations that we don't really know all the details. But it does make sense that you have 2 strong administrators that they might rub shoulders a little bit, and it's no accident, I think, that by 22 Spicer comes in, and his is a very different, wouldn't you say, a different administrative style?
Yes.
And that probably also, that different style of leadership probably contributed to them being able to continue on in a very different way, and to allow for the work of North America to continue and the General Conference to work harmoniously together without there being quite the same tension. That's my personal hypothesis of what I see happening.
But there's another context to this too, which you didn't have time to address, and which I think is important for Jonathan's question, which is that in those 5 years, all the divisions were either called Division Conference or Division Mission. Now, to many in the audience, that may seem a really opaque title, but it mirrors the Union Conference and Union Mission. The Union being the sort of the chief building block of the church. And a union conference refers to the conference, which is the local regional organization. And a union conference was self-funded and therefore entirely self-governing. A union mission, or a mission or union mission even today, has funding that comes from a parent organization and doesn't have complete autonomy in its own affairs. So all the divisions that existed in 1909, in 1913 get converted into being division conferences or division missions. So it's not simply that they say that we will dissolve the North American Division Conference. They convert all of them to being a division, and they lose the title division conference or division mission. And the reason that is given for that is that there's the potential for clashes between divisions and the General Conference. Because the divisions now have their own constituency, for those 5 years, they are seeing themselves as acting more autonomously, and so there's the potential for conflict. And I think probably part of this story is about the relationship between the General Conference and the European Division, which actually was massive because it includes more of Africa than the African Division, because it includes all of these European colonies. The Adventist Church was actually structured like European empires. So the European Division included the whole Russian Empire, so it includes vast tracts of Eurasia and much of Africa, and it's being led by Conradi, who is a particularly difficult person to get on with by this stage of his life. So I suspect there's more to be said. The dissolution of the North American Division Conference isn't just about the difficulties that the General Conference is having with North America. There's a wider issue going on.
Yeah.
And thereafter, divisions all become simply divisions of the General Conference. And that's still the case today. They don't have their own constituencies, and the division is not a division of the Adventist Church, it's a division of the General Conference. So, but for those 5 years, all the divisions were either division conferences or division missions.
That's a very good assessment. I couldn't have said it better myself. So, yeah, and by the way, Conradi, he really was a strong force of personality. He's kind of renegade, and they're trying to bring him back. And also part of the context is World War I had just happened.
Yep.
So that's also a struggle, is how do you deal with sections of the denomination that have been cut off by war. So just like a lot of history, it's kind of a little bit complex and a little bit muddy. Yeah, great.
All right, well, please join me again in thanking Dr. Campbell for a very significant. And we thank the Weis Library for hosting us. In the past, we've been in the HMS Richard Divinity building, but this is our first time in the Weis Library, so we thank the library for hosting us. Please come again next year, when the lecture will be on October 22, a day of obvious historic significance, and will be given by Dr. Merlin Burt, who is the director of the Ellen G. White Estate. So we hope you'll join us in 12 months. And next summer, be on the lookout for volume 4 of the Journal of Adventist Archives, in which Dr. Campbell's lecture will appear, the full lecture with all the footnotes, so that you can look forward to seeing the full text as opposed to just the edited highlights. But the recording of this lecture will also be placed on the WAU Honors College website. And again, from the General Conference Office of Archives, Statistics and Research, we thank our partners in the Honors College, especially Professor Haas and Dr. Scriven. So thank you for coming out, and have a good rest of your evening.